For this video, we're going to go into the process of using the crown and bridge module. So I'm finally going to have a video for that. To start off here, you need to have watched the previous video on making these models, because there is a necessary step in which you create a die and a label for it. You give it a tooth number. That assignment process needs to be done before this. So if you haven't watched my model video yet, go back and watch it. I'll have it bookmarked and sectioned off for where the die cutout stage is. That way you can just watch that. If you want to skip the process of making a full model, you can. All you need to have for sure for this part of the process to work is a separate die and have it nested with these objects in here. You need the ditcher, the margin, and the working die, and you need to have the tooth number assigned to it properly. So that's all done in that previous stage. So please watch that video first before moving into crown and bridge. All right, so crown and bridge. Module up at the top is C and B. It's the third one in. And because we're working on tooth number 30, you'll notice we have every tooth number listed out here. I know it seems kind of bulky compared to a lot of other softwares, but this is the best way to kind of divvy out the workflow and make sure that you're able to do everything you need to do. So keep an eye on your tooth numbers and what you're working on, because even when you're working on multiple units, you'll need to work within each workflow individually first before you work on the whole design. All right, so there are multiple steps in the workflow here. For most of them, you do not need the models to be in view, so we're just going to go ahead and take those and ghost them out just like that. And yes, you can, if you want to ghost things out and bring them in, just click on one and move the mouse down while holding it down and holding the button down, and you'll bring them in and out accordingly. Okay, so step one for the crown and bridge workflow is to basically apply a short die spacer to it. So we're going to do a die spacer and a block out in this first stage, and that's all located under undercut. So we'll click on undercut 30, set offset value. So this is comparable to a cement spacer, essentially. Right now we have this set to a strength of 0.01, and that should be good enough, but I used to have it set to 0.02. We were getting pretty good fits, but they were a little bit passive. We found this to be a better result for our zirconia. So 0.01 will work. We'll go ahead and commit to the offset value, and that will apply it to the object. You'll notice that it changed color. It went from like a darker tan to a lighter tan. That's kind of what you want to see here. Next, we'll click on lower die survey. This is going to utilize the Z-axis of the scene, and it's going to project downward and create a blockout model essentially for us. So one thing to keep in mind, this is set to a predetermined height, basically away from the center of the scene. And that's what we're seeing right here, is this flat surface. So this one will work just fine for the normal function. So from here, what you would want to do is just rotate the die and make sure that you're lined up with the Z-axis as best you can. So something more like that, maybe. It is very laggy here. If your PC is a beast, it might not be as bad, but just keep in mind that there is a little bit of time between when you click on rotate, so I press R to rotate, and when you actually move your mouse, you won't see it happen right away. Not every time. So like that would be too far in that direction. So I'll move it up a little bit. You'll eventually get a feel for where you want things to land. For the most part, as long as everything's pretty well centered, shouldn't be that big of an issue. Now, in the case that you get into this step and this pink line right here, this cutoff is actually above your margin, you're going to need to drop it. So in this case, I don't need to do this, but if you find yourself in a situation where you do, I will give a little bit of an advanced tip here for how to get around that. There's a plane that is hidden from view right now. You'll notice that the eyeball over here on the right is highlighted, yet the text is dimmed out in comparison to this other plane. This plane determines the height of that cut of the blockout material. So if I bring that into view, I can lower it down and it'll allow me a little more freedom of movement. So if I need to do that, the best way to do it is to double click on this little triangle right here. And what that does is that changes these settings down in the bottom right. If I scroll down, find visibility, drop that down, and click on show in viewports, you'll see this plane populate into the scene. Then what I can do is grab it by clicking on it once, press G, press Z, so I'm moving it on the Z axis, and just drop it down a little bit. Once it's where I want it to be, I'll click to apply it, and then I'm going to hide it again. So I'll just hide it in viewports by clicking on that viewports button again. There it goes. And then I'll click on my die again so I can continue to rotate it if I need to. Now this one doesn't have many undercuts, so we'll be good with this for our block out. So I'll go ahead and click on accept lower die survey, and that will then bring me into a sculpting mode where I can then add or subtract away some of the block out that's occurring on the die. So I get a manual adjustment if I want to. I recommend, this is also where I tend to apply any sort of milling spacer that needs to be placed on the die. I do this visually. I know every other software will calculate it mathematically. We're not mathematicians. We're not even computer programmers here. So algorithms like that are kind of beyond us. So this has been a visual thing. There is another option moving forward later on that you can also use for the milling spacer if you need to apply that to the corners and objects. But honestly, this one is a really good example of a die that probably doesn't need a lot. If anything, this corner might be a little bit difficult for the mill to get. So I can add a little bit of material there. And I'll just do that because by default, I'm on a tool, which is called draw. And that will add because it's on the adding setting. I just drop the strength down a little bit. I will apply this up here on the occlusion. If you go too crazy with this spacer here, you'll end up with a very, very, very loose fit. So be careful. Oh, Control Z that a little bit. I'm going to take the strength down. There we go. I switched over to a smoothing tool to do this. There we go. I think that'll do the trick. Everything around here looks pretty well rounded, so we shouldn't need any additional spacer. Okay, then once I'm happy with my block out the way it's been applied, I'm going to click on Create Block Out Die, and that's going to fuse these two objects together and make that our working surface. Now, the whole time this is happening, if you look over in our collection, we still have a working die 30, which is the original die that we had before. So we're not going to lose that. We're just going to be working on this one moving forward because this is going to have the spacer that we need and everything. So I'm done in the undercut step. I'm going to shrink that up and we're going to move down to die prep 30. The first stage of die prep is to set the margin thickness. So I'll go ahead and click on that once. It'll automatically place this here. We've got our margin back into view and it also puts this little line on the outside. Now that line is set to default to 0.15 millimeters away from the margin itself of the die. So the idea being here that this will ultimately become our margin line offset for zirconia. If you need it to be thicker, you'll obviously have the ability to sculpt that in later. But that's just for our own intents and purposes. This has been a good setting for us. So we'll go with it. From here, I will click on die prep. So I guess I could show. So the milling offset here, there's an option for it. So if you want to do that instead of the painting the milling offset and you want to have something that's more mathematical, this will give you the space that you need, but it will probably give you a little bit too much. But either way, if you hold down Alt and right click, you can click on Design Milling Offset and it'll bring in a snake just like what we worked with the margins and everything else. So I can grab that. It's just a lot bigger. And extrude it where I need it to be. There we go. Something like that. And let's say we'll apply and modify the offset, and that'll take us into the sculpting toolkit where we could try to smooth out the transition for it and everything like that. So this is going to be a really bulky one. You can see my problem with this is that it generally creates an undercut by default, so you end up having to smooth away a lot, and you basically end up doing this by hand anyway. So there's not really, in my opinion, much point in this when you can visualize it. But this will give you a block out that will be mathematically correct initially. And if you sculpt it down too much, you're kind of losing that. But either way, it gives you that ability. Let's say we fuse it. We'll go with it. Why not? Yay. Okay. So we got our additional offset there. Either way, from here, I'm going to go into die prep. So we'll click on the die itself. Make sure that the margin line offset is not also highlighted. It would be yellow or orange if it is, like that. You don't want that. Click on the die, make sure it's the only thing highlighted. Your margin line offset should be white. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and click on die prep, and that will bring us into this mode where we are painting. So just like when we're trimming the models, we get the paintbrush tool. If by chance your tool is like looking really soft and faded, if you go under brush and set the hardness up all the way, it'll give you a lot of more of a harsh edge to it. I've just found that sometimes by default it's not quite where it should be. So I like to paint this on anywhere that the if you were working, let's say in 3 shape, it would be the extra cement space would go, because this is just going to be an additional layer of spacer on the model. That actually makes it a little bit more of a passive fit in comparison to where it was prior. Okay. So I've painted that where I want it. The comparison here, and the reason that we have it as a paintbrush function, is because if you were doing waxing or anything like that, you would literally paint the dye spacer on the die. So the whole kind of goal and approach to this software that my father and I had when producing it was to make this an easier transition from analog working to digital, in that you're using the same logic, right? We're painting on the spacer. We make the model first, and then we can make the rest of the production. So the rest of restoration. So that's the concept here. So this would be literally painting on the dye spacer. And then when you click on extract spacer, what that's going to do is it's going to expand that area and actually give it a thickness wherever you painted it. So you have an option to change the thickness. 0.1 has been a really good setting for us lately, but you might want to make it thicker or thinner, up to you. From there, once you've chosen your thickness, you're going to click on apply spacer, and then that'll turn it into something we can sculpt on. So from here, we can start smoothing it out. One little tool that helps out sometimes is pressing F on the keyboard, and you can change the size of the tool, the radius. Don't know why it's F, but that's what it is. I'll increase the strength on this one too a little bit. Try to blend that big blump we put in there earlier. And I like to blend in this edge. It should be mostly inconsequential, though. It's not going to cause like a problem if you don't. But for me, I'm a bit of a perfectionist when it comes to that, and I like to get rid of it as much as I can. Because it's technically an undercut, it just doesn't really... It's small enough that it really isn't for any mill that I know of. So it should be fine. This, honestly, because I did that that additional spacer, might be a bit of a problem for a mill, but I think by blending it in like this, you would end up in a position where it should be fine. So something like that. You don't need a spacer absolutely everywhere, but it's just an additional little help to allow the crown to seat down. So from there, I'm going to fuse the spacer, and that's going to be added into our prep die function. So now we've got all of the spacer we need here. If we cut to this surface with the crown, we'll end up with a good fit. Next is to create a coping. So we're going to coping creator. And what this is really, it allows you to set a minimum thickness value that you can use to visually adjust your crown to, and also allows you to create a additional little minimum thickness coping that will ultimately become the intaglio surface of your restoration. So to do these, I'm going to start with create minimum thickness. I have it set to measure out to 5/10. So that's what the thickness value is right there. And I'm going to say cut thickness to margin. What that's going to do is it's actually utilizing the ditcher from when we did the die cutout process. And it should cut it. But we're not seeing that cut occur right now. And I'm not sure why. See, so this could be a bit of a problem. Let's find out what's going on. Let's bring the ditcher back in. So it's there. I am going to click on this once. Click on Boolean. So this is some immediate troubleshooting that you're seeing right here. At this stage, what should be happening is this thickness area gets cut by that ditcher. And it does so using a Boolean method. There it goes. Let's go ahead and get the ditcher out of visibility again so we can see what's happening. Visibility. Get rid of it in viewports. Oh, I've clicked too many times. Let's wait. Okay. So I'm going to apply that cut. The other thing that would happen here is it would actually cut to the die as well, and it hasn't done that either. So after that cut is finished, I'm going to go ahead and apply that as well. So I'm just going to go back into add modifier, do a Boolean cut again. This time I'm going to grab this and I'm going to cut to the prep die. What we should see is this yellow area kind of getting rid of it here. Now, all of that said, what you just witnessed was a troubleshooting session here. Because the cut didn't function the way it was supposed to. So it normally does. I've tested this on all the teeth at this point. So I'm not sure why it didn't in this case, but if that ends up being something that repeats, then I am open to receiving bug reports on our form on our website. Just let us know, and we can make sure that that gets fixed with the next release, and also provide a workaround if anything like this occurs. So anyway, now that that's been finished, I'm going to go ahead and apply that. And now I have two separate objects here. I've got the thickness that I actually want to use to design my crown to, and then I've got the rest of the thickness that's sitting on the die below it. Kind of looks like a bit of a wax kind of situation there. So now I just need to select the object that I want to keep. So there's a select parts to keep function right here. Click on that thickness and then remove extra parts. And that'll get rid of it. So I've got my minimum thickness now. It's a little bit rough around the edges. It's got this like corner here. You can sculpt on it if you want to. What I'm going to do is just take it out of view for the time being, and I'll bring it in when I need it. And I'm going to create a coping now. So this should be minimum thickness, even smaller coping of 0.15. So this should be basically your margin thickness. And again, we will cut this to the margin. I'll do cut coping to margin this time, and we'll see if that one works the way it's supposed to. There it is. That's what you should see, something like this. Then we'll go ahead and select parts to keep. I'll click on the margin up top that I want and remove all the other parts. And there we go. So next is to bring in a tooth. We're finally, after all of this, in a spot where we can start designing. Our tooth selection area has 4 libraries to choose from. Clark is one that's specific for one of our doctors, Dr. Clark. She likes the specific kind of anatomy that we have where it's not too detailed, but it gets the simple stuff out of the way, that kind of thing. We also have a generalized library that I believe is modeled after some denture teeth that we had. Then we've got the youth library and the age library, which are both custom made by Craig Holland. So my dad, he custom built those, and I tend to like the youth one. I think it's easier for me to edit, but the Clark one is also very good. But it depends on your situation and what the adjacent dentition is. I'm just going to go ahead and bring in the youth library for now because I'm used to working with it. And we will get this thing moved over the tooth in general. Just get a general placement, kind of, right? And this is probably going to change. And then what I'm going to do is over on the right, remember when we did our models, we created duplicates. We're going to bring those duplicates in now because now it allows me to look through the model and see, oh, wait, I'm way high in occlusion. I'm also way heavy on my contacts, but I'm in about the right area that I need to be in. I just need to adjust the specifics. So you can rotate your view to change the way grab works. We can rotate the crown with R. We can resize it with S. And we can start figuring out where we need this to be in general. And then from there, say it's a little too small, but if I resize it, it's going to size it too much in all directions. We can shrink this down and go into the crown finishing stage. So the last little drop down that we've got here. This first button toggles in and out of sculpt mode. None of this can honestly be done up here under object mode on the top left. You can go to sculpt mode there, but sometimes this is a little more convenient to get to, and it always defaults to the elastic deform if you use this button, which can be very helpful sometimes. So I'm going to start bringing this out and just kind of bringing it out to the margin in general. But now is a good time for some basic design stuff. Doesn't have to be too specific, doesn't have to be too perfect. All right, we're not breaking through right now, but I am kind of curious. Let's bring in our thickness. So I'll go back up here in the collection, bring the thickness in. Okay, so the blue is not breaking through anywhere here, but you can see it's breaking through here. So those are areas that would be a little too thin. We want those, like I said, that's set to 0.5 right now, 0.5 mil. So if it's around the margin area, it's okay because that can actually get thinner. But for the general wall thickness and the occlusion, we want to make sure we're hitting that 5/10 at least. Now, if you want to, you can move just in one direction here, up and down, by holding down Control on the keyboard. Sometimes it's a little easier to mess with these settings by doing that. Okay. Let's bring the opposing out. Let's look at what we're really looking at here. Got a little bit more. So I think I'm going to use the adding tool, the draw tool, to take care of those spaces. And you'll probably find which tools work best for you. I like the draw tool, for instance. My dad, when he's designing, he prefers the inflate tool when he's adding material. So to each their own. I just have personally better control with this one. That's what I like to use. But there's a whole toolkit over here, each with different functions. And there are some I still don't even know, honestly, what they do, because I haven't really needed to mess around with them that much. So, well, don't want that one. The opposing model's got too much going on. The duplicate does not. So it's a lot easier to work on. Okay. Let's say I'm happy with that for the placement and the size and everything. So the only other things left are the contact areas. You can just cut to the contacts using a Boolean cut, even on a scan that's hollowed out like this, and it will work. But the problem I have with the Boolean cut is it's also going to cut this area around the margin, and that can be a bit of a pain to try to fix. So I'm just going to manually sculpt this back and do it visually, which isn't recommended in most cases. Usually you want to do a cut so you're more precise, and then you can always sculpt it back in to get some contact. But something like this, we've been finding some super light contacts tend to end up resulting pretty good in our end result. But again, this is going to depend entirely on your manufacturing process, how you're producing it, like your materials, everything. Like, just because we found our happy spot here doesn't mean that yours will be exactly the same. So it might take a little trial and error to figure out exactly what you need to do to get this where you want it to be. But that is where we'll be happy. So from here, I need to attach this to the margin. As of right now, I've just got a floating ponic, essentially, just hovering over everything. So we're going to go into toggle sculpt mode. We're going to get out of sculpt mode. Then we're going to click on trim tooth for attaching. And funny enough, this is going to take us back into sculpt, but it's also going to make the tooth, the crown, translucent, so we can see through it and we can see what we're doing. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the duplicate models here, so we can just look at this. And I'm going to try to draw right on the margin, essentially a line. So I'm just going to paint it in here. There we go. I'll click on cut masked areas to cut that off and select parts to keep, remove extra parts, and relax the edges. I'm going to do that a few times here and make that a nice and soft transition. And then I'm going to click on join tooth to margin, and that should snap it into place just like that. And also bring us back into sculpt mode with a smooth function here. So I'm going to bring that up a little bit. I'm going to strengthen it up. By default, this brush setting should be set to mesh boundary. What that means is that this edge right here where it meets the margin, it's not going to allow me to sculpt on that. So I can get in here and go crazy. It should protect my margin. Now that said, if you decide to go and use the elastic deform tool, by default that will not be set to mesh boundary. So if you do decide to use that, you will need to make sure you turn that on, the mesh boundary function. Again, that's under brush. But at this point, I already got my contacts where I want them. This thickness doesn't matter so much because it's right at the margin. But if I need to, I can strengthen that up a little bit. And that draw function is not set to mesh boundary, so we'll go ahead and turn that on. And make this a little smaller. Good. There we go. Smooth it back out a bit. Let's say we're happy with that. Then from there, all we need to do is exit final sculpt, which is a button down here on the right, and that will finish snapping it in and also join it to the intaglio surface from the coping, and that should give us our crown. So just to confirm that, I'm going to go ahead and take this prep die function over here on the right and turn that off so I can look inside. And that little splotchiness you see is the thickness, so we can turn that off now because we don't need that anymore. And there's your crown. So to verify that there's no holes in the mesh and no issues with it, we can click on the prepare for printing button, even though it's not just for printing, it's also for milling. And you can see it found like a problem with one vertex and one edge. So we'll click it again. Now it's got no issues. We can export this. Now this one, you'll notice, actually shouldn't be on batch mode. So we'll go ahead and turn that off. We'll call it test crown. And we'll save that to our desktop as an STL file. And that's it. If you want to make sure everything's good, you can save your blend file. I like to do what's called an incremental save, which will take the existing blend file and just add a number to it and just make an additional save file for it. So if I need to basically go back in time to fix something from before this situation, I can open up a previous save. But that's it. That's the Crown and Bridge workflow. That's all you got to do. It's all you got to do. It's a lot of steps, but once you get used to it, it's actually not too bad. You can fly through these designs. So thank you very much for watching.